actions of people, such as terrorists or workplace violence, which are, I put those together in a group, but they are certainly hazards we have to deal with. The source, just distinguish a source in terms of it has to have enough energy. If it's an energy, it has to have enough of energy to cause harm. If it's a chemical, it has to have enough concentration or dosage to cause harm. If it's a biological hazard, it has to be sufficient to cause harm. And same with workplace violence. So all of them, if they're below some kind of level, we're considered acceptable, and we don't really think of them as a hazard. When they get to the point where they could cause harm, we call them a hazard. And the consequences, it's fascinating to read all these definitions. The one we saw from the American National Standards Institute was injury, illness, or death. That's a nice list. Probably that's what a lot of us would use. But there's many other organizations that have different views on that, and I'll point out two, U.S. Department of Defense and a farmer. So the Department of, a farmer, if you think of a farmer with chickens and he sells the eggs, makes a little money, maybe not a lot. Farmer wants to protect his chickens. And who does he want to protect his chickens from? It's the fox who keeps trying to break into the hen house. So the farmer's perspective on a hazard would be a fox. And then you have a wildlife biologist down in the left side. His perspective is quite different. He wants to protect the fox from the farmer's shotgun. So you can see two different organizations, the farmers versus the wildlife biologists would define hazard in a different way. So that's why I include in my definition whatever you're trying to protect. And each organization can have some different ideas on that. The U.S. Department of Defense talks about injury, illness, death, equipment, mission, systems. So they're very broad. They include environment, so they make a long list. Instead of making a long list, I think it's better to just let each organization define what it is they're trying to protect, because they have different needs. I want to talk about what I'm talking about with sources. What are the different sources of hazards? And condition is one of the most broad sources. But if you think of your walking and working surfaces, the mines themselves, the buildings, those are all places where you can have them in good condition, poor condition, or in between. And they can be a hazard source if they're done in a poor manner. So we all have some kind of standards that we think a building should have, a floor should have, a ladder should have, a stairway should have, and so on. We have hazardous locations, like confined spaces or areas that have high level of contaminants, or electrical hazards or electromagnetic hazards. We need to treat those as a condition that's just waiting for somebody to show up. They're not really doing any harm until somebody shows up, gets exposed to it. Then they have an increased risk of injury or illness because of that condition. And we also include your equipment defects. If you think of a haul truck where the brakes have finally worn down and they need to be replaced, you get to a point where the brakes are in bad shape, that becomes a potential source of a crash or turnover, and so they would be considered a condition of your equipment. The area of forms of energy, I've categorized them in this way. I found that purely focusing on the injury that's the direct cause is not very practical. It's a little easier to categorize them this way. For example, a bullet, somebody shoots a gun at a taxi driver trying to rob them. You could say it's the robber was the source, or you could say the pistol was the source, or you could say the bullet was the source, or the powder inside the bullet was the source. You want to overanalyze it, and you could be more like a physicist. But from a practical point of view, the safety and health, we would probably just say it's the robber who had a pistol with him. So we have kinetic energy, electrical energy, acoustic energy, your noise source, vibration energy. In many industries, we have electromagnetic hazards. I consider fires, explosions, and pressure hazards are related, but each one is a bit unique, so I included them in three distinct categories. Pressure hazards is also, you can have high pressure and low pressure hazards, and heat and cold are also sources that are associated with some workplaces and cause some kinds of injuries or illnesses. I put into one category your weather and geological events, and only those that are very intense and unusual would be considered hazards. For example, mudslides only occur occasionally, but when they do, they can be quite hazardous to people and facilities and homes in those locations. Earthquakes, similar. There's a lot of chemical substances, and these are generally considered part of the industrial hygiene field, but we're good to know that we have to include those because they are sources of illnesses especially. Biological agents, there's a lot more than just bloodborne pathogens and mold. There's a lot of kinds of exposures that are health problems, but there's also a number of injury problems, especially people who work outdoors. They can be exposed to poisonous plants. Pets can be a hazard for your mailman, especially vicious dogs. Wildlife and livestock can be a hazard for farmers and ranchers. So there's a bunch of different biological hazards that could be sources. And then musculoskeletal stressors, which is kind of a specialty of me. I was in the area of ergonomics for quite a few years. I treat these as stressors. They stress the body. When it comes to musculoskeletal, you have lower level musculoskeletal stressors, which are generally considered good. For those of you, if you think some days you might go in and to work and you spend almost a whole day in your office on a computer, you're not getting very much musculoskeletal stress, and that's not healthy if you do it every day. Other days you're out walking around and visiting, and that's much more healthy for your cardiovascular system and muscles. But some people have jobs that exceed their capabilities, very heavy manual materials handling and repetitive motion types of jobs. So those can be sources of musculoskeletal injuries and illnesses. And then I mentioned violent actions of people. I don't see this in the other books that people have written on occupational safety and health, or maybe that's a separate chapter, but they don't really think of these as part of the definition of hazard. And really from a occupational safety and health point of view, we should treat those as hazards. Workplace violence results in a lot of deaths at work, and acts of terrorism, not very often, but when they do, it can be a lot of people killed at the same time. And so those can be part of our domain of hazards. So that's a definition of hazards, a source capable of causing harmful consequences, with each part of it defined more precisely separately. Another distinction I want to make is a term we use a lot, hazard control, and maybe a less commonly used is risk reduction strategy. I thought about what to put it for a title of my book, and the more I thought about these, I realized risk reduction strategy is a better term. And let me explain what I mean. When you do a risk assessment, and there are various ways, and mining companies in the States, I know from a lot of my students have told me, mining risk assessments are done by small teams of miners before they go out to do a job, and they get together, identify the hazards, put some kind of rating on the severity and probability of harm, identify what they're going to do to avoid those things, and then they can proceed. So that's one way. And then there's other ways. You have, like in the nuclear power industry or a chemical plant, they have a very formal way of doing risk assessments, multidisciplinary, complicated, requiring a lot more person hours. So all of them are kind of follow a 6-step process. You have to get started by defining what you're going to assess. Maybe it's a task, maybe it's a process. And then identify all the hazards, and that's a step where it's important to identify everything that you can see as a hazard. And then give some kind of rating, an initial rating of those hazards. And that's before you put controls on. Then the 4th step is choose among all the different possible ways to reduce the risk from that hazard. And this is where we see terms like hierarchy of hazard controls, and we see strategies, and we have tactics, and this is some areas of some significant differences. And then when you reassess the hazard level after the controls are put in place, or it can just be a projection into the future that if we put this into place, we will reduce the risk this far, and that helps us make decisions about how much we're going to commit to avoiding harm from that particular hazard. And then decide from the remaining risks, assuming there are at least some remaining risks, what would be acceptable. So what I want to talk about is this particular process when we're choosing our controls. Standards I've read, and they seem pretty consistent, both books and standards written by important committees. Each committee should follow some kind of hierarchy of controls, where they first consider the best, most effective controls, and then work their way down to the least effective. And the term hierarchy of controls, hierarchy of hazard controls, that's the most common term. And an alternative term is what strategies you use, which strategies are the best. And we'll see there's a lot of similarity, but they're a little different. This graphic shows the difference. If you look on the left side, you see phases of an incident where somebody's injured, or a haul truck tips over, or something goes wrong, maybe you have a fire. There's a pre-event phase where things are going normal, and then the normal processes start to fall apart. Then a during event when your hazard controls and things are not working well, and processes get to sort of run away. Those two things are part of hazard control. That's a good way. That's what they're trying to do. They're trying to control the hazard, keep it from harming people. So hazard control is good for that. However, hazard control does not apply to the post-event phase. And you have a mine rescue team. That's all after the event, right? Environmental spill team, first aid, All these things are after the event has already occurred. And those things are just not included in the term hazard control. So with risk reduction, those are included. You think about it, if you have an environmental spill and you get right on it and do a good job of cleaning it up, you reduce the overall long-term cost of it. Or somebody is injured and you give them good first aid, you can reduce the medical costs and the time off work. If you don't give them good first aid, they may have a prolonged injury, more medical costs, and more days off. So that's why I like the term risk reduction better than hazard control. And that is the distinction. So that's my book, Risk Reduction Strategies. That brings us to the question, what's a strategy? And get into that, it's under this category, what's a hierarchy versus priorities? And what are strategies versus hazard controls? So go back, 1970s, we had a couple thought leaders who were in the field of occupational safety, well, different fields really. Johnson was in the nuclear power perspective on things, and he developed 12 hazard controls. And these were broad forms of hazard control, like separate the hazardous source from the people, for example. And William Haddon came up with what he called strategies for prevention of all injuries and illnesses and harm, very broad. He came from a public health point of view. He knew about roadway safety and public health perspective. So that was Haddon first published in 1975, and then later in Hazard Prevention, Journal of System Safety. So they had two of them. I took and examined those two and came up with a list that I took the best ideas from each of these authors and developed a list of strategies. So when you think about it, you're doing a risk assessment, you want to have a list of strategies to choose from. And you'd like to choose the most effective one. Look at that first. And then work your way down. If you can't think of this, if you can't think of that, or maybe you can implement 2 or 3 different strategies. But at least consider